Nobody moves when Adrian Cross walks into a room. Nobody reaches for their phone. Nobody makes eye contact. Not the cooks behind the line. Not the regulars nursing coffee at the counter. Not the 3 other waitresses who suddenly discovered they had urgent business on the opposite end of the diner the moment his black SUV pulled up outside. The man who controlled every port on Lake Michigan, every backroom deal in the Loop, every shadow transaction in a city that ran on shadow transactions. He came to Lark Henley's section at 11:48 on a Tuesday night and sat down like he owned the floor beneath the linoleum. He probably did. He had a girl with him. That was the part nobody expected. Not the 4 men in black coats who spread out around the diner like sentinels. Not the manager who'd already retreated to the back office and was very pointedly not watching the security cameras. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, with her dark hair in 2 uneven braids, and Adrian Cross's same severe jaw softened into something still learning how to be a face. She was wearing a ladybug rain jacket over pajamas. She was holding a stuffed rabbit that had seen better decades, and she was watching Lark with the patient, measuring gaze of a child who'd learned early that adults were largely unreliable. Lark Henley was 22 years old. She had $43 in her checking account. She had a section to cover. She walked over. The other girls didn't breathe. Maria, who'd worked the night shift for 11 years and had a 6th sense for trouble, actually grabbed Lark's apron strings from behind the counter. Lark unhooked her fingers gently and kept walking. "What can I get you?" She directed the question at the girl, not the man. The child looked up at her uncle. He looked at Lark with eyes, the color of deep water, in a place where things went to disappear. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite surprise. Something more like recognition. "Hot chocolate," the girl said. "Coming right up." Lark pulled out her pad. "Sir?" "Black coffee." His voice was exactly what you'd expect from a man whose name people lowered their voices to say. Low, unhurried, the kind of quiet that had never once needed to shout. She brought them exactly what they ordered. She refilled his coffee at 11 minutes past midnight without being asked. She brought the girl a second packet of sugar and a paper straw without anyone requesting it. She did not hover, did not gape, did not treat the corner booth like it had an electrified fence around it. She just worked her section. It was 20 minutes later, while Lark was rolling silverware at the far end of the counter, that she heard it. A sound like a wrong breath, then another. She turned. The girl's hands were pressed flat on the table. Her face had gone a color that had no business being on a child's face. The stuffed rabbit lay on the vinyl floor where she'd dropped it, and she was looking at her uncle with eyes that said she was trying very hard not to be frightened. Adrian Cross was already on his feet, jaw locked, scanning the room with the particular panic of a powerful man, discovering there is something his power cannot fix. His lieutenant was on his phone, presumably calling someone. Everyone else was doing what people do when disaster arrives uninvited. Nothing, or something that looked like nothing. Lark was already moving. Is she allergic to anything? She was at the table before she'd decided to cross the room, 2 fingers pressing gently to the girl's wrist, pulse fast, breathing shallow, lips starting to swell. "What are you?" One of the men in black coats started toward her. "Is she allergic to anything?" Lark said it again, not louder, just slower, looking directly at Adrian Cross. "I need to know right now." A beat. Then, tree nuts. She can't have, there was something in the hot chocolate. "My fault. I should have asked." She was already moving again. "Does she have an EpiPen?" "In the car." Ty, the lieutenant, was gone before the name finished. "Okay." Lark came around the table, crouched down so she was eye level with the girl. Up close, she could see the child fighting to stay calm, chin trembling, small hands curled into fists on her knees. "Hey, what's your name?" "Rue." It came out thin. "Rue, I'm Lark. Can I put my hands on your shoulders?" The child nodded. Lark helped her lean forward slightly, spoke quietly to her about breathing slow and steady, kept 2 fingers tracking her pulse, kept her voice even as bedrock. She'd done this before, not with a crime lord's niece in a diner at midnight, but with her younger brother in a parking lot when he was 9, and they'd been too poor to keep his prescription current, and she'd talked him through it with nothing but a calm voice and hands that didn't shake, because panic was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. The EpiPen arrived in 40 seconds. Lark administered it cleanly, stepped back, kept watching Rue's color. It shifted. Slowly, but it shifted. Nobody spoke. Adrian Cross was looking at Lark with an expression she couldn't name. His Lieutenant Ty stood 2 steps back, watching. The other men had gone very still in the way that large, dangerous things go still when something surprises them. "She needs to be seen tonight," Lark said. "Even with the pen, she should have a doctor look at her within the hour." "Understood." Adrian's voice had changed, not softer exactly, but different, like a frequency shift. He reached into his jacket. She expected money, or a card, or some gesture that would make her uncomfortable. Instead, he took out the stuffed rabbit from where it had fallen and placed it back in Rue's arms with a carefulness that had nothing to do with anyone watching. The child clutched it to her chest and exhaled. That was the moment. That small, private thing. The most feared man in Chicago setting a worn-out rabbit back where it belonged. Like nothing about power or reputation or the city that moved at his instruction mattered as much as that one small act of returning something lost. Lark looked away, gave them space, went back to the counter and finished rolling silverware like the last 20 minutes had been an ordinary Tuesday. Right now, you're thinking that was the beginning of something. You're right, but you don't know yet what kind of beginning. Because what happened in that diner didn't just set 2 people on a collision course. It put a target on Lark Henley's back that she had no idea was there. And if you want to know how a girl 3 weeks behind on rent ends up being the one person in Chicago that Adrian Cross cannot afford to lose, then stay with me. This is that story. And before we go further, if Rue's face, or that rabbit, or the way Lark moved without hesitating is already somewhere in your chest, hit that subscribe button right now. Sadie's Romance Library runs on exactly this kind of story, and we are just getting started. To understand why Lark walked across that room when everyone else backed away, you have to understand what walking away from things costs a person when they've been doing it their whole life. She grew up in Peoria, Illinois, in a house held together by habit and stubbornness, and not much else. Her mother worked. Her father disappeared, not dramatically, not in a blaze of disaster, just gradually. More time between visits, longer silences, and then one day the absence became the fact, and she stopped explaining it to teachers when they noticed. She was 12. Her brother Denny was 4. The math of caring for someone smaller than yourself, when you're still small yourself, is a particular kind of education that no classroom offers. She learned to cook on a hot plate, learned which bills you could be 2 weeks late on, and which ones you couldn't. She learned that the one thing she couldn't do, ever, was let her face show the panic. Because Denny watched her face to know if things were okay, and so her face had to say things were okay even when they weren't, even when she'd been awake since 4 a.m., moving numbers around that wouldn't resolve no matter how she arranged them. By 17, she'd worked a dry cleaner's counter, a grocery floor, the front desk of a motel where she learned not to ask questions about the guests. She graduated high school while carrying a 20-hour work week. She deferred community college enrollment twice. She didn't defer it a third time because by then she understood that for someone like her, some doors don't stay open long enough to wait for a better moment. Denny got a scholarship, partial but real. She covered the rest the way she covered everything, quietly, without ceremony, skipping her own birthday dinners, wearing shoes a half size too small for 8 months because new ones weren't in the budget, sending him care packages assembled from the day-old shelf at the bakery. He was finishing his 2nd year. She was proud of him in a way that felt too large for her chest. She'd been in Chicago 8 months, sharing a 1-bedroom in Pilsen, with 2 women who also worked nights, sleeping in rotating shifts. She ate what the kitchen sent back. She owned 4 pairs of shoes and 2 good work shirts, and a winter coat she'd found at a church sale that was too big but warm enough to matter. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was working toward a version of things marginally better than the one she had, because that was how it worked, and she had made peace with the math a long time ago. Adrian Cross started coming in every week. Not every night, not conspicuously, just periodically, late, always in her section, always the same black coffee, always a tip she tried not to calculate against her weekly earnings, because the number made her feel things she didn't want to examine. He didn't bring Rue again. He usually came alone, or with Tay standing near the door like a shadow in an expensive coat. He asked her name, formally properly, on his third visit. She told him. He asked where she was from on his fifth. She told him that too. On his seventh visit, he said, "You weren't afraid that night." Lark refilled his coffee. "I was." He looked at her over the rim of the cup, waiting. "I was afraid the whole time," she said. "I was afraid from the second I saw her face go wrong. But being afraid and stopping are two different things. I had a brother, I knew what to do, so I did it." He set the cup down, said nothing for a long time, then quietly, "She asks about you, Rue." Lark didn't know what to do with that. She nodded and went to check her other tables. But on the subway home, with her feet aching and her jacket zipped to the throat against the February cold, she thought about a little girl in a ladybug raincoat asking about her. It felt like something. She wasn't sure it was safe to let it feel like something. 3 weeks later, they came for her in the parking garage. Two men she'd never seen. One leaned against the concrete pillar near her bicycle, like he'd been there long enough to know her patterns. The other stood near the elevator, unhurried. "Lark Henley," the one by the pillar said. "Denny Henley's sister." She stopped. The garage was empty except for the three of them, and the sound of traffic bleeding through the walls. "We know about the scholarship. Partial, right? The rest is loans." He tilted his head. "A lot of debt for a kid studying engineering. A lot of years paying that off on a waitress's salary." "What do you want?" The second man stepped forward. He was holding something small, a drive, flat, black, the size of a thumbnail. "Adrian Cross meets with a man named Ryland Whitlow on the first Tuesday of every month. Back booth of your diner, 1 a.m. We need what they lead to discuss. That's all. Listen, remember, pass it along." Lark looked at the drive. "Who are you?" "People who can make Denny's loans disappear. People who can make sure he finishes school without either of you spending the next decade drowning." The first man's voice was almost kind. "And people who will make things very difficult for both of you if you choose wrong here." "You're asking me too." "We're giving you a way out," the second man cut in. "Men like Cross make liabilities out of people who get close to them. You already saw something you shouldn't have that night. He knows it. Sooner or later his world reaches into yours and pulls everything down. We're offering you an exit before that happens." They left her the drive, told her she had a week. She stood in that garage until the cold drove her out, the drive burning a hole in her palm like a lit coal. Denny's voice on the phone the night before. "I think I want to work on infrastructure, bridges, the kind of work that lasts." 20 years old and already thinking about building things that outlast him. She'd pressed the phone to her ear and thought about how he sounded like their mother used to, before the hard years turned her voice into something smaller. She had a week. She had $41 in her account. She had a brother who trusted her to have a plan even when she didn't. She went to work. She stopped using the parking garage, started taking the bus and varying her routes. She covered Adrian Cross's section exactly the same as always. Coffee, no questions, the precise distance that wasn't cold but was an invitation. She watched, she thought. On the Thursday of that week, she arrived early for her shift and found Tay sitting at the counter with his hands around a coffee cup, looking at her in a way that said he was there on purpose. "He'd like to speak with you," Tay said, "when your shift ends." I figured. They met in the back room. Not his territory, just the diner's storage, shelving units and industrial cans of tomato sauce and the low hum of the walk-in cooler. Adrian Cross stood with his coat over his arm and looked at her with that assessing stillness, except something underneath it had changed. She placed the drive on the shelf between them before he could speak. "Whitlow's people came for me 6 days ago." She kept her voice even. "They want whatever you discuss in the first Tuesday meetings. In exchange, they offered to clear my brother's student loans." A pause. "I'm not telling you because I'm afraid of what you'll do if I don't. I'm telling you because they're wrong about you." I don't know what you are or what you've done, and I'm not asking. But the man I watched put that rabbit back in Rue's arms, that's not theater. And I won't help someone take him apart. The silence in the storage room was absolute. Adrian Cross looked at the drive, then at her. Something in those deep-water eyes moved in a way she'd never seen before. They told you I'd make you a liability eventually. Yes. They're not entirely wrong about how my world works. I know that. He picked up the drive, turned it once, set it in his pocket. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He sat down, on a crate near the shelving unit, like the conversation had earned a different posture. Your brother, he said. Engineering? Infrastructure. He wants to build bridges. A long pause. Something moved across his face she could only call careful, like a man stepping around something fragile that he was only now realizing was there. I'll make the loans disappear, he said, legitimately. A scholarship endowment. His name won't be near mine. He held up one hand before she could respond. Not payment, not an exchange. I'm not buying your silence or your loyalty. I'm acknowledging that you stood in front of something you could have ignored and chose not to, and I'm returning the gesture. Lark looked at him. And Whitlow's people, he continued. His voice didn't change, but the weight behind it did. I'll be handling that. What does that mean? It means Ryland Whitlow is going to be very busy with his own problems and won't have time to think about you or your brother. She didn't ask what form that would take. She'd learned by then that some questions were doors she didn't need to open. Whitlow disappeared from the Chicago business landscape with the quiet speed of a rumor nobody bothered to repeat. No spectacle, no headlines, just an empire collapsing in on itself from the inside, like a building where someone had removed the load-bearing walls while the lights were still on. Denny got a letter from a foundation she'd never heard of. Full scholarship coverage, retroactive. He called her crying. She sat on her bathroom floor and listened to him cry and kept her own face still, the way she'd learned when they were small and he needed to believe everything was going to be fine. She didn't see Adrian Cross for 2 weeks. Then he came back on a Thursday, off schedule, something he'd never done. He brought Rue. The girl came in wearing a yellow dress and the same battered rabbit and sat at the corner booth like she lived there. And when Lark came to take their order, Rue looked up with that grave, measuring gaze and said, My uncle says you're the bravest person he knows. Lark looked at Adrian Cross. He was studying his menu with great attention. That's a high bar, Lark said to Rue, coming from him. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean, Rue said, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd built her whole understanding of the world around one person's consistency. Lark brought the hot chocolate first this time, confirmed every ingredient with the kitchen, made sure. She watched Rue wrap both hands around the mug and exhale with satisfaction. Small pleasures. The kind that don't cost anything and are somehow worth more than everything. Later, near closing, when the diner had emptied and Rue had fallen asleep across the booth, with her jacket folded under her head and the rabbit tucked to her chest, Adrian Cross said, I don't let people in, not to the parts that matter. Lark was wiping down the adjacent table. She kept wiping. I built what I built because I understand exactly what people are capable of when given the right incentive, which means I don't trust incentive. I don't trust people who gain from proximity to me. He looked at the sleeping girl. She's the only one I don't calculate the risk of. And me, Lark asked. He considered it seriously, like a man who didn't give answers he hadn't fully constructed. You gave back the drive, he said. You had nothing to gain and several things to lose. You don't fit any of the patterns I know. Is that good or bad? I'm still determining that. But the edge of his mouth moved in a way that was almost, something warm. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Fairy tales require a logic that life in Adrian Cross's orbit didn't offer. There were nights Lark heard things she couldn't unhear, and she held all of it the way she'd held everything difficult since she was 12, at the right distance, with both hands steady. He didn't ask her to be something she wasn't. She didn't ask him to be something he couldn't. They were two people who had learned, through entirely different means, that the world was not built for softness. and had chosen, each in their own way, to remain soft in the places that mattered most. Rue got a new rabbit when the old one finally gave up its stuffing. She named it Lark. She told this to Lark directly, with great solemnity, as if conferring an honor. One night, Lark came off a double shift and found Adrian waiting by the door. Not his men, just him, coat on, keys in hand. "I'll drive you home," he said. She looked at him. "You've never offered that before." "No." She waited. "I don't know how to do this," Adrian Cross said. "I know how to run things. I know how to take things apart and put them back together in configurations that serve me. I don't know how to." He stopped, looked at the sidewalk, looked back at her. "I've been trying to find the angle, the risk calculation, some framework that explains why I keep showing up here. And I can't find one." He said it like a man admitting to a structural deficiency. "The math doesn't resolve. You're not an asset. You're not a liability. You're not strategic. You're just," he exhaled, "you're just someone I want to drive home." Lark looked at him for a long moment. At the man who'd built a city within a city from nothing, who ran on calculation and controlled silence and the certainty that every person had a price, standing on a sidewalk in the February cold telling her, very honestly, that she didn't fit his system, that he'd tried to fit her, that she wouldn't go. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Drive me home." He held the door. She got in. The city passed outside the windows, all that light going nowhere and everywhere at once, and she thought about Denny and bridges, and the specific shape of a life built from whatever you could carry. And she thought about a rabbit named after her, sitting on a little girl's bed, somewhere in the part of the city she'd never been near, and she thought about a man who'd spent his whole life deciding who was worth protecting, finally running out of arguments for why she wasn't on that list. She wasn't the girl who had been saved. She'd never been waiting to be saved. She was the girl who walked across the room when everyone else backed away. Not because she was fearless, but because fear and stopping were two different things, and she'd learned that distinction so young it had become the architecture of her. She had found, without looking for it, the thing she'd stopped believing existed, a place where her steadiness was not a burden she carried alone, where the years it had cost her were recognized for what they were, proof of a life fully lived, and a person fully present, and a kind of courage that never announced itself but showed up every single time it was needed. That is what this story is. Not a rescue, not a redemption arc with a bow on it. Two people who learned to survive alone, discovering in the most unlikely place imaginable that they didn't have to anymore. Now I have to know, which moment got you tonight? Was it the parking garage, the drive on the shelf between them, or that last thing Adrian said about not being able to find the angle? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Like this video if you want more stories like this. Subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. I'll see you there.